All right, are you ready to dive in? Because today we're going to be really tackling something that's been a source of debate and discussion for years now. Feminist perspectives on sex and gender.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of folks out there might think, oh yeah, sex and gender, got it, easy. But trust me, there's so much more to unpack here. We're talking about going beyond simple definitions and really digging into some complex philosophical arguments. And luckily, I am not alone. I have an expert guide with me to help navigate these really fascinating kind of twisting and turning ideas.
I'm happy to be here.
We're going to be diving into excerpts from a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, so we're not messing around here.
We're bringing the big guns.
Exactly. We're bringing the intellectual A game, but I promise I'm going to do my best to keep it engaging, keep it relatable, and most importantly, make sure it's something that gets you thinking. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Let's jump in.
Okay, so I want you to think back to all those old school ideas about biology is destiny.
Yeah.
You know, like this notion that your biological anatomy dictates your entire life. It sounds ridiculous now.
Right.
But this was actually used to justify some pretty messed up stuff, particularly when it came to limiting women's roles and opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And this article gives this crazy example from 1889.
Okay, hit me with it.
It's about these two researchers, Geddes and Thompson, and they actually published a theory. And in this theory, they claim that women's metabolism actually made them unfit for politics.
You're kidding me.
Oh,
Their
no,
metabolism.
I'm not kidding.
What, were they eating too many sandwiches and couldn't get to the polls? What was the logic there?
So they argued that, because women conserve energy, that this actually made them too passive for the rough and tumble world of politics, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas men were out there just had all this energy to burn and therefore destined for leadership.
Oh, brother. You can't make this stuff up.
I know. And this wasn't like a fringe theory. I mean, this was considered serious science at the time, and it really fed into this broader societal belief that women were just too emotional, too irrational, too whatever, to be trusted with serious matters.
Wow. It's one thing to kind of hear about that sort of bias, but to think that they were trying to back it up with scientific claims.
Right.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But it does make it very clear why feminists really felt this urgent need to push back against this whole biology is destiny
framework.
Right.
Sure.
It was this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
This is not how it works.
Yeah.
And that's really where we start to see this very important distinction between sex and gender emerge in feminist thought. And it was a way of saying, hey, just because you are born with certain biological traits, that does not mean it predetermines your social role, your capabilities, or frankly, just who you are as a person.
It's like they were trying to draw a line in the sand, right? Between what we consider biological, the actual physical stuff, and what's actually socially constructed. All those expectations and roles that get piled on top.
And I think one of the most interesting things that they did was they actually appropriated this term gender to very specifically refer to those social and cultural factors that shape us.
Yeah. It was we're taking this word and we're going to infuse it with a whole new meaning.
It's a power move.
It is. Because before, gender really just referred to grammatical gender in language. And so it was this brilliant move to say, no, we're going to use this word to talk about all the stuff that's not just about your biology.
So they were saying biology might deal with chromosomes and hormones and all that. But gender, that's about the meanings, the expectations, the roles that we as a society kind of slap onto those differences. Mm-hmm. And by making that distinction, I feel like they opened up this whole new way of thinking about, maybe women are perfectly capable of making their own decisions.
Of course.
About their own bodies, about their lives, about whether or not they want to be involved in politics, or frankly, anything else they set their minds to.
And that was really the point. This wasn't just some abstract academic exercise. It was about saying, we're not going to let these arbitrary biological categories limit our potential.
Totally. And one of the things I really like about this article is it highlights Gail Rubin's idea of the sex-gender system, which I think is such a powerful way to think about this.
It's such a good phrase.
It's so to the point. Mm-hmm. And what Rubin is saying is, it's not just about individual choices or preferences, but there's actually a whole system in place, right? Yeah. That's trying to almost pigeonhole us into certain roles and behaviors based on our assigned sex.
It's this is how it's always been, so this is how it has to be, right?
Yeah, it's those unspoken rules we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
So we're not just talking about individual experiences of gender here, but about something much bigger, right?
Right.
It's a more pervasive system that's influencing how we raise our kids, the laws we make.
How we see ourselves, how we see each other. It's huge.
It's everywhere. Right. You can't escape it.
You can't. And understanding how this system works, how it's maintained and enforced, is absolutely crucial if we want to challenge those norms and create a more just and equitable world.
So we've established this sex-gender system thing, right?
Right.
Which, by the way, I'm going to use air quotes every time I say that because it's kind of a mouthful.
Right.
But we've established it's there, it's real, it's shaping our lives in some pretty profound ways. But it's not always like super obvious, right? It's not like this big flashing neon sign, hey, the gender system is at work here.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of like insidious almost.
Sneaky, right?
Yeah.
Like, how does it actually work? So it's operating on like multiple levels. It's those big societal structures, but it's also like the subtle ways that we interact with each other every single day.
It's like an invisible web.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
The invisible web of the gender system. And one of the ways this article really kind of digs into how it operates is through something called gender socialization.
Yes.
Okay, gender socialization. So on the surface, it's like, okay, I kind of get it. It's in the name, right? It's how we learn to be gendered beings. But I have a feeling there's a lot more to it.
Absolutely.
So break it down for me.
Yeah. So at its most basic level, gender socialization is that process from pretty much the moment we're born where we're learning what's considered appropriate behavior based on our assigned gender.
So it's like downloading the rule book.
Yes. Exactly. And the rule book, it can be different depending on where you are, your culture, all these different factors. But it's basically the set of expectations about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman.
It's like, here are the rules. Don't break the rules.
Or else.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it starts early. It's not like we wait for kids to pick up a book and be like, all right, here are the gender norms.
No. It's from the moment a baby is born.
Right.
Think about it.
It's the pink and the blue.
It's the pink. It's the blue. It's, oh, look at her little dress. Oh, he's such a bruiser.
Yeah. That's all those little comments that we don't even think about.
Exactly.
But it's sending these messages, right?
Totally. And what's so fascinating is, like, there's research on this that shows how deep these biases run. So, for example, the article mentions the study where parents were asked to describe their newborns, right?
Okay.
And even when these babies were dressed in gender-neutral clothes,
Really?
parents still, like, used really gendered language.
So it wasn't even about what they were seeing. It was like some deeper association.
It was subconscious.
Wow. Okay, that's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. And it's kind of scary, right? Because we think we have more control over our thoughts and perceptions, but this shows just how deep-seated some of these biases can be.
And then, so it starts from there. And then it's just what snowballs. Like, as kids get older, it just gets more intense.
Totally. Yeah. Because you start giving girls dolls to play with.
It's all about nurturing, right?
It's all about nurturing. It's about appearance.
Yeah. You look so pretty in that dress.
Exactly. Boys, you're giving them the trucks, the action figures.
Go out there and conquer.
It's all about competition.
Domination. Don't cry.
Don't cry. Be tough.
Unless you're angry. You're allowed to be angry.
Yeah, you can express anger, but that's it.
That's it.
That's the only acceptable emotion.
Otherwise, man up.
Oh, God, man up. The worst. It makes me so mad.
It's so frustrating.
It is. But it's like these messages are everywhere.
They're everywhere.
You're right. Like, even if you try to shield kids from it at home, they go to school, they watch TV, they're online. It's books, it's movies, it's advertising. And it's not just even the media. It's watching how adults interact with each other.
Okay.
We're constantly reinforcing those messages.
We're modeling it.
Exactly.
So we're swimming in this sea of gendered expectations. But I want to back up for a second to this idea of the rule book, right?
Okay.
Because you download the rule book, but what happens if you don't follow the rules, right? Like, what happens if you don't fit into these neat little boxes?
You're told to get back in the box. No, I mean, that's really where things can get really tricky, right?
Kind of painful.
Yeah, exactly. Because you might face all this pressure to conform.
You're the odd one out, right? You stick out.
Exactly. And it can be, you know, when you're a kid on the playground, it can lead to bullying.
It can be isolating.
It is isolating. And it follows us into adulthood, right? Because then it's about career choices. It's about relationships. There's just like all this pressure to conform to these really narrow ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman.
And it's not even just like outward behavior, right? It's like those messages seep in and they kind of form how we see ourselves.
This is about identity.
Yeah.
This is about how we understand ourselves at our core. And that brings us to another like really important theory about how gender is socially constructed. And this is the work of the psychologist Nancy Chovro. And she really focused on like these early childhood experiences and how they actually shape our personalities, specifically what she called feminine and masculine personalities.
Okay, so I'm interested, but I got to stop you there for a second, because feminine and masculine personalities, I mean, I can already feel people cringing a little bit when they hear those terms.
Oh, I know.
Because it's like, isn't that just buying back into the binary?
It's tricky.
Yeah. So tell me more about how Chodorow is using those terms and why this theory is significant.
Yeah, so it is a little bit outdated in some ways, the language that she's using, but her work is actually really influential in terms of understanding how those really early relationships that we have, especially with our primary caregivers who tend to be mothers, right, in most cases, how those relationships shape us.
Okay.
And one of her key arguments is that because girls are primarily raised by women, right, by their mothers who they identify with, they tend to develop what's called more fluid ego boundaries.
Wait, ego boundaries. Now,
Yeah.
There's a term I haven't heard in a while.
I know, it sounds very like therapy speak, right?
It does. So remind me, for those of us who haven't been on the therapy couch in a minute, what are ego boundaries?
Okay, so basically, your ego boundaries are that sense of separation between yourself and other people. So fluid ego boundaries basically mean you experience a greater sense of connection, like you're more empathetic, you have more of a sense of oneness, you could say. Whereas like really rigid ego boundaries would suggest a stronger sense of independence and autonomy. You're very much like, I am me and you are you, and there's a very clear line there.
Got it. Okay, so that makes sense. So because, like, girls are primarily raised by mothers who they share a gender identity with, they develop this greater sense of, like, interconnectedness and empathy, you could say.
Yes, exactly. And that then gets labeled as feminine, right? Like that tendency to be more relational, more attuned to others' emotions. And then on the flip side, Chodorow's argument is that because boys are raised by someone of a different gender, they're encouraged to, like, separate and individuate earlier on.
They've got to break away from mom.
Yeah, exactly. And so that leads to like more rigid ego boundaries, which then, you know, stereotypically gets labeled as more masculine, that emphasis on independence and, you know, sometimes emotional distance, unfortunately.
So it's not that boys are incapable of empathy.
No.
It's that they're socialized in a way that doesn't necessarily prioritize or reward those qualities.
Totally. And look, this is complicated. There are so many factors that go into shaping who we are.
Yeah.
But I think Chodorow's work is really valuable in showing us how much those early relationships can be so influential.
Right, because we think about, like, oh yeah, gender roles, that's something you learn later on. But she's saying, no, this stuff is being baked in from day one.
Absolutely. We don't come into this world as blank slates.
Yes.
We're like little sponges, just absorbing everything.
And so if those patterns are so ingrained, if it starts that early, then how much agency do we really have to change them?
It's a really good question. I mean, that's like the $1,000,000 question, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that feminists continue to debate. How much change is possible?
Yeah. Are we fighting a losing battle here? Or, you know, how much can we actually shift these patterns?
Exactly. And some people argue, look, we need to like totally restructure the way we do caregiving. It shouldn't just be women who are primarily responsible for raising children. And others focus on like dismantling those really rigid gender norms that limit both boys and girls. So there's no easy answer, but it's an ongoing conversation and it's something to be really mindful of, I think.
Absolutely. And I love that we're having these nuanced conversations, right? Because it's not just enough to say, okay, gender is socially constructed.
Yeah.
Like we have to grapple with the implications of that, you know, both on an individual level and a societal level.
For sure.
But before we move on, I do want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, which is that there are other feminist perspectives that offer like a more power-focused analysis of gender, right? So far, we've been talking a lot about like these subtle cues and, you know, kind of like unconscious biases that we internalize through socialization. But you mentioned Catherine McKinnon, who takes a much more like explicitly political approach, right?
Exactly.
And argues that gender is fundamentally about power relations. So I'm really interested in diving into that because I feel like that's where things start to get really, really interesting.
Oh, yeah. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty.
Okay, so we're shifting gears a little bit here, moving away from like childhood development and socialization and getting into something a bit more I don't know, intense.
Yeah, we're turning up the heat a little.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned Catherine McKinnon and her work on sex and gender being like really centered on this idea of power dynamics. Mm-hmm. So how does that play out? What does she mean by that?
So for McKinnon, it's not just about these subtle cues we've been talking about or those unconscious biases that kind of seep in through socialization. It's like way more explicit than that. She's talking about a system, a historical system, where men as a class have held power over women.
Okay, so it's about a very specific kind of power here.
Yeah.
Not just like, oh, some people have power over others, but something rooted in, you said, sexuality.
Exactly. It's about how sexuality has been understood and frankly controlled throughout history. And McKinnon argues that under this system, masculinity becomes kind of intertwined with dominance.
Okay.
While femininity is associated with submission.
And that's where that power dynamic comes in.
Exactly. Because it's not just about men and women being different, which, obviously there are biological differences. It's about how those differences have been used to create a hierarchy, right?
So it's like taking those differences and then assigning value to them in a way that creates an imbalance.
Totally. And it's about control, right? Yeah. Who has the control in those situations? And for McKinnon, a lot of that comes down to sexuality, how it's defined, how it's expressed, who benefits from it.
And we see those tropes everywhere.
Right.
Like, think about movies, TV shows. It's like the assertive male boss and they're like, submissive female secretary or the knight in shining armor who swoops in to save the damsel in distress.
Oh, yeah. All those classic tropes that we see again and again and again.
Just like they're reinforcing that exact power dynamic you're describing.
Totally. And what's really important to remember about McKinnon's work is that she was coming at this in the 70s and 80s, and her work was really groundbreaking in terms of highlighting how these power dynamics manifest in really harmful ways, especially when we're talking about things like sexual harassment and violence against women.
Right, because those things don't happen in a vacuum.
Exactly. It's not just about a few bad apples, right? Like, oh, that guy was a jerk. McKinnon saying, no, this is systemic. This is rooted in these unequal power dynamics that have been around for centuries.
Of course, McKinnon is probably most famous for her work on pornography, which remains a very controversial topic. Yeah. How does that fit into her larger analysis of gender and power?
Yeah, so pornography was really central to McKinnon's work, and it was also incredibly controversial. But for her, pornography wasn't just about sex, right? It was this key site where she saw those harmful power dynamics being eroticized and normalized.
Okay.
Because her argument was that a lot of pornography, and again, this is, a huge generalization, but her argument was that it often depicts women as objects for men's pleasure, right?
Okay.
Which then reinforces this whole idea of male dominance and female submission.
So it's not just a harmless fantasy. It's actually shaping how we view each other and how we interact in the real world.
Exactly. And this sparked so much debate, right? I mean, people were like, well, what about free speech? What about censorship? Who gets to decide what's okay and what's not okay?
Big questions.
Huge questions. But what I think is so valuable about McKinnon's work is that she forced us to have these really uncomfortable conversations, right? To really examine those power dynamics that are often lurking beneath the surface. And again, her work is not without its critics.
Of course.
But I think it's so important, and it really laid the groundwork for a lot of the conversations that we're still having today.
Yeah, because what we're seeing is that these theories of sex and gender, they're not just these abstract academic exercises, right?
Right. Yeah.
They have real world implications.
Huge.
And they can fuel a really intense debates about law, about policy, about individual rights.
It gets messy.
It does. It gets messy, but it's also so essential if we want to understand these issues on a deeper level. And that, I think, is what this deep dive is all about, right? It's about taking the time to really grapple with these complex ideas.
Absolutely.
So we've covered some really fascinating ground here today. I always learn so much from these conversations.
Me too.
But I also want to acknowledge that we've just scratched the surface, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
There's so much more to say, and we've had to kind of zoom over certain nuances and complexities, but hopefully this has given you, the listener, a lot to think about, maybe some new terms to Google, some books to add to your reading list.
Yes, and don't be afraid to challenge these ideas, too.
Right.
We've been talking about feminist theory, but there are other perspectives out there, and it's important to engage with those as well, to think critically about all of it.
Absolutely. And to never stop questioning, to never stop learning. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive into feminist perspectives on sex and gender. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic, so make sure you subscribe to the show and join us again soon.